I want to thank you for taking the time to join this morning's webinar on IPA, the next steps. Take your flows to the next level. And with that, I give you Jeremy and Jeff.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to IPA, the next steps.
There we go.
The next step is clicking this slide. So a little bit about RPI. I've been here for 3.5 years now, and it's wonderful. We do lots of fantastic work, many IPA people on staff, and we love to educate you too about different Infor products through this webinar series. So thank you so much for joining.
A little bit about what we're going to cover today. For those of you who might have seen this, a similar presentation title, IPA Next, we have done this in the past, but we've tweaked it and modified it. This is kind of an ongoing topic, and we will continue to modify and add new agenda items as we see fit. There'll be some repeat, but there's definitely some new material in here as we go through. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is enhancing approval flows and what we can do to just streamline our approval flows. So we want to talk about an exception handling in basket. So when you've got approval flows that are running through that approval process, and then there's whether it be an AGS transaction error or a problem with a SQL query or something like that, you can build into these flows the ability to capture those errors and then divert it to an administrative task, as opposed to maybe there was an issue with the database. Those are the typical types of errors that we see that kind of interrupt an approval flow. And maybe instead of having the work unit fail, it goes to this administrative task and then gives that administrator the chance to look at the flow, look at the error, and then kind of revert it back to where it failed and kind of pick it up where we've left off.
And then the administrator has the option of continue or maybe end or anything that you want, like any typical user action.
Yeah, again, this is stuff then logic that needs to be built into the flow. But if you think about it a little bit and you build in those failure points, then we can add this stuff in.
So one of the things we want to talk about is approver security and even just your approvers. We want to make sure that any user that we're going to send work to has a PFI user account. Remember, they may have an actor record, they have access to the system, but not every actor is going to be an in-basket approver. So we all know that we have to add users to in-baskets to make it work. And sometimes maybe new users come on and they haven't been fully set up if you don't have the automation maintenance to do it. Maybe you just don't know who's the approver. But as we add users to tasks or use the HR user action, we want to make sure that these users have that record so they can get the work that is coming to them via their in-basket. So we're going to write some logic in there to check whether this person exists, and then we'll update that user account on the fly. Make sure that they're able to access it through their in-basket in the portal or Mingle, and also give them the proper security roles to their actor account. Now, another way you can do this, and if you're on version 11, is to have a sub-process. So the sub-process is a wonderful, wonderful feature where you could build your own library of flows. A great example is managing this user, making sure that your users are active. So you could use this in a rec approval, you could use it in a journal entry approval, you could use it in L action approval, anything that you want to do, because it's really all the same thing. I pass in a user account, I'm going to check it, make sure it exists, and then if it does, life is good. Otherwise, let me go and create it on the fly. No sense in rebuilding all of these nodes every time. Have one, call your sub-process, and return it back.
Up next is enhancing your notifications. So more and more clients are utilizing the email function, the email approval actions in their approval flows. And the way that works is, of course, there's an option when you're setting up that user action to enable those buttons in the bottom. So we want to look at those email messages, those notifications that go out, and tell the approver that, hey, you've got something to do here. So, making those email notifications as relevant as we can, providing as much information as we can for that approver to be able to look at it and make an immediate decision and not have to log into the system to review the data and go through that. So just streamlining that process for those users. Now, as you begin to do that, your email text tends to become very long and lengthy. And of course, as you're building that message out, even if you're using the message builder node, and you've got multiple approval levels, that data, if it's too big to store in the database, and I think it's 256 characters, then it doesn't persist through the life of your flow, and you have to rebuild that essentially each time.
You'll end up having funky HTML.
Yeah, so there's a couple ways around that. Number one is rebuild that email body at each approval step so that you're regenerating all that code. That's a lot to do, because if you need to change the content of the email message, then you have to do it in multiple places. Another option is to use the input data variable. So if you're familiar with the file channels, and even other flows that are triggered, they'll pass data into the flow sometimes in that input data variable. So a file channel may pass the file contents or the file name. Well, if that's not utilized, you can actually do a landmark transaction to write your message out to that variable and then just retrieve it later. And then it's stored and available to you, and you don't have to rebuild that. And still, it's just one place that you're updating it and then retrieving it multiple times. And then the third option is you could write all that out to a text file, just a temporary file that's sitting on the server. And again, you're writing that one time, and then you're just retrieving it each time. Another thing that I like to do is enhance the emails with a little bit more of HTML style sheets. So again, one way to do that is just have a message builder node in your flow that puts all that style sheet information in there, and then you include that when you build out your message. The other thing you can do is you can edit the CSS and the configuration, and this is in the translation configuration. So there's the email header configuration, translation entry, where it actually already has a basic style sheet created, and that if you're familiar with the action buttons in that email, that's what defines what those buttons look like. That's the only style that's in there right now. But you can add to that, and then any of your emails will automatically use that style sheet when the HTML option is checked. And then that kind of gives you a consistency of formatting and going through. Maybe you're changing the colors of the headers or things like that to match your company's colors or things like that. So this is an example of an email. Again, I said edited using that style sheet. So this particular example I used to create the headers and the table definitions is with the colors of the client's logo. And basically, so this is kind of a checklist then of what we think is a good content of an email. So we're looking for all that transactional data, the header and the detail information. We're looking for an approval history. So maybe you've got 3 or 4 approval levels throughout this flow, and the third approver wants to say, okay, well, who already approved this, because this doesn't make sense to me, and there might be some question. So that person can then reach back and see all that history right in the log that's included in this email. Maybe there's links to related documentation. So for example, a supporting document, you could link to a document imaging system that, again, you pull all that information in and have that available to the user right from that email.
And if you're curious about how to get this information, especially when it comes to the approval history, tomorrow's webinar on reporting, we're going to go into some details about where this information resides and how you can easily retrieve it.
One thing to touch on as we talk about approvals by email, so there is the actions-based URL. So that's if you want to make your URL externally available, you have to create a separate endpoint, and then to do that, you have to change that that one configuration. There is the login information. So prior to starting with a release last September or October, email authentication is now required. It used to be an option, but moving forward, it's always going to be required. So that just means when they click that action button in the email, they are forced to log in to authenticate. So it opens up a web browser and forces them to authenticate into the system. There is an option to allow email forwarding, and basically what that does is, so when Process Flow sends an email notification to somebody with those actions in it, it knows there's a unique ID embedded in that URL. It knows who it went to, and then when that user logs in, it can validate to say, okay, this is who I think it should be, this is who authenticated, and if you have that allow email forwarding set to false, if those names don't match, the system will deny that approval, basically.
And one thing to note about the reading the user's sub-zero variable, the reason that the 0 is in there is because a user is technically an array. And think about your options when you're selecting a user action. You can proceed when any one user takes an action, which is the most common, but you can also have users by committee. So let's say 3 of your 5 approvers must approve. So therefore, you would have a user 0, 1, and 2. But if you only proceed when there's one user that has to take an action, you can safely use the 0 index of the user variable. But it is an array. A lot of people are like, oh, I never even thought about that.
As Jeff mentioned earlier, we'll talk a little bit more about this information tomorrow in the IPA reporting webinar. But approval history, just wanted to highlight this a little bit more. This is stored in the PFI metrics table, and we want to include this because, like I said, it makes it easier for those end users to see that approval status. So you can build it out in an HTML table to include in your email notifications. Another thing to do with the approval history, so if you're familiar with any of the process flows that capture all that approval, you know, on the left here, you can see a couple user action nodes, and then each one of those branches to an assign node where it captures the action taken and by who it was captured, and it's using the name of that action node to essentially put that in there. It's kind of hard-coded in a way. And if you've ever had to make a tweak to those, or maybe you've renamed the user action node, you then have to go into those assign nodes and make the adjustments as well. In the middle there, you see it's all consolidated, and so every single action, whether it's an approve or return or reject, is funneling down into the same place. And that's basically querying that PFI metrics table, looking at the last action that was taken, and capturing what the action was, whether it was an approve, return, reject, the actor, the authenticated actor, because again, they could be different, and maybe approval messages or comments or anything that were added within that. So it's just kind of a way to streamline those processes so that you don't have to hard code the node name and things like that into it. And it just kind of cleans it up a little bit too.
So we're going to now talk about how to use IPA to manage user accounts. User accounts, of course, are a big source of maintenance for anybody, and IPA is a great tool, especially when your employee master resides in your system, be it S3 or into GHR. Get these users into the system, make sure that they're ready to go. You can even create an Active Directory account from IPA using the system account node if you know how to do Windows PowerShell. You can use PowerShell for just about anything, as long as you have the right credentials. So whatever you can do on the command line, you should be able to do. Multi-tenant does provide a little bit of a challenge with this, so keep that in mind that you may not have these tools available to you in a multi-tenant environment.
The other thing you can do as you're provisioning your accounts, specifically your Lawson accounts, you can use role-based security based on their job type or the job category that the person's in. So you may know, okay, anybody coming into the HR department within this department or this accounting unit assigned is going to get the generalist role, or maybe it's by job position, or you can assign a recruiter role automatically. Any of these security things that you can define a set of criteria to, you can build these out in IPA so that it's automating all of that stuff for you, even assigning the security roles. Comparing your employees against your actor role business class and looking for what you're missing, basically. So any records new employees that might have come in, and basically saying, oh, I don't have an actor record for these yet, so I'm going to go ahead and create one and add that security in. Just an example of that, I've gone through and I've written some queries where it's basically looking for discrepancies. So looking for HR supervisors, for example. So the HR super table, of course, contains that supervisor information, and sometimes people move from a non-supervisor position to a supervisor position, or vice versa. And this, you can write a query that basically pulls the discrepancies, and you can either delete the role or you can assign the role to the actor. And this can be done on a scheduled daily basis. Again, with global HR, of course, you know that there's the actor context that needs to be set up, such as an external job board, the HR organization that needs to be assigned, finding internal candidate agent records, and linking all of those agents and contexts together, and that can all be done automatically on creation of an actor.
And then there's multiple ways that you can provision your users. One way is you could do a web call to ISS if you intercept the string, and you can properly substitute out the variables. It's a little risky, but it does work. When you do it online, when you do it through the ISS tool, you know that it automatically propagates to LSF and landmark, and everything works properly. But getting to that point of building that URL does take a little bit of effort. Another thing that you can do is you can provision in RM using the resource update node, and you can use landmark transactions to update the actor. And that's a very important piece of this, especially if you're an IPA for S3 customer only. You want to make sure that that landmark user is created. Even if they're not an in-basket user, you want to keep these actor accounts in sync. You could also trigger a list-based sync with a system command node, so that way you get your users synchronized between S3 and landmark.
And that becomes important because ISS contains its own database, essentially, of users and repositories, so that it knows how to keep things in sync. So that's why it's important to always have that list-based sync completed, or writing it to ISS directly. Of course, we talk about a lot with interfaces with IPA. So what can we do with that? Of course, we're always trying to improve efficiencies and just make things run faster, and different things that we can do. Orchestrating a series of interfaces. So you can use the trigger node within IPA to, maybe you have multiple processes that are one's dependent on the other. A perfect example is the GHR interfaces to S3, where you have to do things in a certain order to make sure that things are built out properly. So this example here is basically going through four components of that GHR to S3 interface, and it's running them in sequence, and if any one of those fails, it basically captures that error message and alerts somebody, and then they can go back and rerun the process, correct the error, rerun all the processes. And this ensures that there isn't, just because the first part of it may fail, we know that the second and third may fail as well, so we don't even want to waste the time, the resources to do that, so we can capture that and just move on.
And of course, make sure that you have enough consecutive processes being able to run to do something like this. Yep. The default's 2. Yep. So you'll want to change that grid property if you want to run more processes simultaneously.
Another big trend that we're seeing is real-time transaction interfacing as opposed to batch. Of course, we know that doing batch with IPA can be challenging, especially when you start talking about benefit carrier files, which can be very large and time-consuming to build and write out. So we can use a web service node to basically have some event within the application, trigger process flow, and build that information out for that specific transaction, and then call a web service whether it would be a third party or even an internal system that has exposed web services, and then we can pass that information right through. This particular example is going through the talent acquisition module in HR, and when a background check screening package is initiated from the application or assigned within the application, this particular process goes through and collects the data for that candidate and builds the package out and actually transmits the data to via HTTPS to a third-party service that does that background check. And then, of course, the reverse can be polling that, looking for return messages, and update the candidate record. And this is done real time.
And another example, a good example of a web service that's not on the screen, is the United States Postal Service does have an API that you can tap into for address verification. You just have to register yourself, get a username and password, which you would put on your web service credentials. You pass it in an address, and it will return back to you the post office address. You know, whether it's DR, ST, AVE, the correct suite number, the 9-digit zip code, and then you can update your records to keep them in sync. Very important for, especially for W-2s sending out to your employees, make sure their addresses are correct.
Another powerful feature that's available in IPA is the cross-reference tables. These were originally put into IPA for the GHR to S3 interface. With that interface, there's a lot of mapping that needs to happen. So you're mapping the three main statuses on an employee record to a single status in S3. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done there to build out those, and anybody that's utilizing GHR and interfacing that knows the extensive use of those cross-reference tables. Well, even if you're just a standalone IPA instance or you're running both, these cross-reference tables are there and available. So you can essentially create a mapping and build them out and use that within your process flow. And so this becomes just, especially with something like benefits interfaces where you have data that may just require, it's in the database one format, but the vendor may require it to be a different name or something like that. So I see we have a question.
We do. On the first interface slide, what's the difference between that and a regular flow?
The one with the sub-processes, I would assume. I think that was the first interface slide. So that is a flow, but those nodes that you see in line with start are trigger nodes. So what they will do is trigger another flow, and you can run the flows either synchronously or asynchronously, meaning that this particular flow will wait until that flow is done, or they can run in parallel, and that would be your choice. You can run either a process or a service with that trigger node. So that thing that looks like a C essentially is calling another flow.
Okay. This is an example of using a cross-reference table. So I'm working with a client, and it's a cloud customer, and we were trying to figure out an easy way to move files from their on-premise, so they get interface files, whether it be the Kronos file or some GL import files that need to go through. And so they get these files, and the process is to retrieve those files isn't completely automated. They get them, they have to manipulate them. And what they do is they can dump them on a network location. So then I have a process that basically is set up with a file channel to that FTP site. And it comes in and it pulls up that file. And of course, it passes that file name in. And what this cross-reference table does is basically says, okay, I've got a source file, and then I've got a destination on the LSF server where that needs to be. And so what this is doing is it's looking at that source file and saying, okay, the file that I got in, and here's the example where it's querying all the records in that cross-reference setup, in that mapping. And it says, okay, does my file name match what's in one of my cross-reference entries? And if so, then if I go back here, I can see my destination field. So I've got a path where it needs to go, an alternate file name. So sometimes file names come in another system, and like Chronos, for example, maybe Chronos time records with a date timestamp on it as well. Of course, we know on the S3 side it just needs to be PRTRS-CSV. So you can rename the file. So what this process flow is doing is just doing all of those options, and then a notification option to basically say, okay, here, I picked up this file, I moved it, it's now ready for you to process and run the PR530, for example, for that one.
Think of this as configuration sets on steroids.
Yeah, so it's basically looping through a set of those entries and looking for a file name match and then moving it to the appropriate location. So at any point in time, if I've got now a new file that's coming in, I'm utilizing a new batch load process, maybe it's another GL interface file or something like that. All we have to do is add a new cross-reference entry, and this will automatically pick it up and process it.
Another good use of the cross-reference table is building a JSON object. And now this is really for the hardcore JavaScript programmers in dealing with JavaScript object notation. But essentially you can build a dictionary. And think about your interface file. You're coming from benefits, and you have coverage options that mean something in your S3 or your GHR system that means something different to your benefit provider. So you can build these tables out in the cross-reference and then build your own JSON, JavaScript object notation objects. So that way you don't have to keep querying all of this data in the system every time you have a new record you want to write. And you can access it a lot easier rather than having indexed arrays and moving through everything one by one. You can say, give me the value of this object of coverage option, and it returns back for you the data that you want. And I believe that we have another question here.
And I have no idea what it means, but I'm going to ask it anyway. On using the xref tables to FTP a file, how would you schedule this IPA to always listen for a new file?
So the file channel itself is what's configured in IPA, and you can set up the scan interval. So basically, however many minutes you want it to run and scan for a file, down to a minute, as frequently as every minute to scan for a new file.
So the channel flow would go into that cross-reference. And what he was setting up the cross-reference table for is that if I have a file that's called PRTRCSV, I want to move it where I can put it and PR530 will pick it up. If I have a file called EMPLoadCSV, we're talking S3 here, then I'm going to move it into the directory where HR11 can pick it up. And I don't have to keep coding everything in my flows to pick up these files. I can simply build a cross-reference table, and then it maps for me where I need to put the file itself. But the initial setup is done through channels and receivers.
Yeah, and the flow itself is triggered off of that, the event when a file is discovered. And like I said, whatever scan interval you define your file channel at, and it will automatically call the appropriate process flow and trigger it at that point.
And here's an example of some JSON in there. We're going to use a sub-process because reading a cross-reference table is reading a cross-reference table. So we can go through and figure out our keys and our values and get the JSON back, and then we can use that within our main flow and call it by dictionary name rather than an index of 0, 1, 2, 3, or an I variable if we're doing a loop.
Just a brief, a couple things on IPA for system administration. So system administrators, we know that we do a lot of stuff to check to make sure the system's running. We want to know when jobs are in needs recovery in S3, and so some things that we can do. So we can do a Lawson health check basically. Like I said, looking for those jobs in recovery status, and we can alert somebody doing it through database queries against the gen data to get that information. We can archive log files that are growing too big and automatically do things like that as well. Monitoring the system status, running some smoke tests, and validating that system functionality. Record timings to analyze trends, so we can run a couple DME calls and say, normally this DME call may take 3 seconds to run, but now suddenly it's taking 15, 20 seconds. So that might be something to trigger you to go in and look into the system a little bit to see what's happening. Some proactive alerts. So what are the common things that you're looking for? Whatever you can query against the database, you can put that into a process flow.
And regarding the timings, tomorrow in the reporting session, we're going to go into some details about how you can generate process data easily, and then you can analyze it and look for any anomalies with your flows.
I want to touch briefly on work unit administration. So in version 9 of Process Flow, there was a feature called admin tasks. And this basically allowed you to a role-based administration of work units. So I could create a group of processes and assign them to an HR admin task. And then I could give that admin task to my HRIS analyst, and that gave them full control over those work units. Well, that functionality doesn't exist in IPA, but it can be built out actually with Configuration Console. And I've done this with a client where we've implemented this. So of course, for an IPA only, Configuration Console isn't enabled by default. You just have to add additional security class to the appropriate role. Once you do that, we can then create some user fields, and we create a user field called admin task. And this is on the PFI flow definition, and we're actually going to create it on the PFI work unit business class as well. This particular example has three states, so admin, AP, HR, and MM for materials management. Then we look at the process definition, and after we create the process and upload it into the system, we have to come out and assign that admin task. Now, once that's done, whenever we can set up the value on the PFI work unit business class as well, and we set it to the default value, and that's based off of the relation between PFI work unit and flow definition. So it automatically pulls that admin task into that. Then just there's an additional security piece that needs to be modified as well. And basically this is then you give that additional security class to those users that, so this one is specifically for the materials management one. I see we have another question.
We do actually have a couple. When the file channel sees a new file, can it tell whether the file is open and is still being written to by the creating process?
Yes, because the file will be locked, because what happens is the file channel wants to pick up and move the file. So at that point, if it can't do anything with the file, if it's unable to move it, it will, I can't remember if it shows an error or if it just kind of spins and waits.
You can configure that.
Okay.
You can configure it to error, or you can configure it to move on. So another side note with this, when you set up a file channel, and especially if you're using remote and you're using FTP, you must have delete privileges on your FTP server to use file channels successfully. But as far as while the file is being written, if that thing sees that the file exists, it's going to pick it up and try to move it. So I would exercise caution with that. Perhaps write the file with your process, your external process outside of IPA, and then copy the file to your monitored folder once complete. That would be my best advice to you.
Yep.
Okay, and the next question.
Yes, sir.
If I can adjust my glasses. Can recurring jobs start, stop, dates, times, for example, be updated by start, stop, dates, and times be updated by a process flow?
I believe so. And my suggestion to you is to look on Infor Extreme and look for a document called iOS for Developers. And this iOS for Developers document contains all of the APIs that you would need to interact with the web calls. It'll tell you how to submit jobs, run jobs, delete jobs, attachments, and I believe that there's a section in there about recurring jobs. But definitely refer to iOS for Developers on Infor Extreme.
All right, now we're going to touch on Infor Process Automation version 11, just some of the new features that are available and some of the ways that they can be used. So first up, of course, is the new HTML5 interface. In version 10.1.1, there was a web interface. It was a little clunky, unfriendly. So a lot of new features, enhancements done to make it just more streamlined and more user-friendly. As we look at the process definitions, the new feature here is now there's a view button. So if somebody has read-only access to the process definition data, they can come in, they can click this view button, and they get an online view of the process flow itself. And you can even click on the nodes and see all the properties that are associated with it. This is currently read-only, but it does give you that view capability without having to assign a user that process developer role, security role that's required to log into Process Designer.
Another good thing that you can do is send IPA an email. You can email Process Automation to trigger a work unit. You can find out what are the status of your work units. You can trigger this. You can check on the health of the IPA system itself by sending it an email. And that's done with your channels. So in your channels, you'll notice some new options when you go to the channel screen. It's not just file and Java. You'll see that there is a user channel as well. And you get information about, you can interact more with IPA.
And this is mostly done by certain keywords in the subject of the email that gets sent into the system.
This was dealing with sub-processes?
Oh yeah, so this is sub-processing. So basically you can define a process, and we talked about this a little bit, as a subroutine, so, or a function call or something like that. And when you do that and when you use that sub-process, because it doesn't trigger a separate work unit, it's all processed within the same work unit. And because of that, because it's all in-memory processing, any variables that were defined or created in the parent process are inherently available in the sub-process. So there has to be a little bit of knowledge, of course, and some standardization if you're using these sub-processes. And then on the reverse side, on the tail end of that, when that sub-process returns, it actually, those variables that were created within that sub-process are then available within the parent process as well. File access is now available with the Amazon S3 cloud, and so the file access node was enhanced because of that. The sub-process here. So when you're defining a sub-process, you have to, if you click on the canvas and not on any specific node, there's an option to check, and it's that sub-process. And that tells the system that this is defined as a sub-process, so it doesn't allow you to schedule it, doesn't allow you to do things. But then when you have another flow with that sub-process node, you then get this option to pick which sub-process, and that list is based on that checkbox.
And another thing to note about sub-processes before we get off of this subject is that your variables from your parent flow are all accessible in your sub-process flow.
Another exciting new feature is SMS capability. A lot of customers have asked for this, and I always say our email boxes are overwhelmed, so we start ignoring our emails. So now we can overwhelm our phones with text messages from the system. It does require a third-party setup with Twilio, and it's a minimal expense. I think it's pay per message, essentially. But when you register an account, you get a token, basically, and you set this up in your configuration. And this is just another configuration set. And then when you're picking this is similar to how the email node works, basically. You pick your actor, or you can even pick a group, and the system will automatically look at the mobile number that's defined on that actor record and know how to send it. Of course, the SMS enabled option has to be checked on that as well. But once it is, then it will automatically look up the phone number, or of course you can hard code a phone number in as well.
And your social feed is opposed to Mingle. So when you log into Mingle, this can post to your user feed, A great example is that cross-reference process that Jeremy was speaking to earlier. My PRTR CSV file was moved and it's done. A nice notification to payroll, hey, this is ready to go. You're ready to continue your payroll processing. Your time records are now imported.
Yep, so just another view. The user's already in the application. As opposed to sending them an email, you could drop a node, a social node, and just alert them right there within the application itself.
An Ldap query, you can query any Ldap system as long as you have credentials to it. So you could query your Active Directory, assuming your network administrators will give you access to do so. Good use for this would be keeping maybe your email addresses in sync. Somebody had a name change, an email address change, anything. If you could query Active Directory, then you can keep your Infor system and your Active Directory synchronized. A little bit about DB import and export. Now this is for landmark database import and landmark database export. This is really critical for those cloud customers, especially in multi-tenant. So DB import is, we're in Art Vandelay's territory here. We're going to import into the database. So maybe our conversion files will go in and then we can process it out. Or of course, be careful with DB import. You don't want to hose your database. But here we have an option for we're talking about exports. So with exports, there are a few options you see up at the top. We have directory, file, and variable. Your file is going to export everything out into a zip file. A directory is going to be equal to the business class that you've exported with a .csv extension into the directory that you specify. Notice there's an option on here that says export to database instead of file system. This is crucial for multi-tenant cloud customers since you don't have access to the file system. It's going to export into the file storage business class. You do have a 2 GB limitation on that, which hopefully will be plenty of space for your export. And another key piece of data to note on DB export is with the filter string. You do have the ability to select multiple business classes and multiple modules from the DB export, but you can only use the filter string if you're doing a single business class export. And the reason that we would want to use this method versus a landmark transaction is to prevent our looping. This way we can get all of our data extracted, available to us, and then if we're skilled JavaScript programmers, we can parse it out or write it out to a file, have it somewhere else without having to deal with the loops.
Yep.
This is just the same thing, but with import, same data. Directories and files are consistent across that too.
This feature is actually available in 10.1.1, but I highlight it here because it's relatively new in 10.1.1. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. This feature is not available in 10.1.1. I'm sorry. Getting ahead of myself here. So the SQL query node, of course, not available for multi-tenant cloud customers. However, if you're on-premise or single-tenant cloud, you still have the ability to query the database. And we know, of course, interfacing, we can write some pretty complicated SQL queries to grab all the data and relations, and sometimes it's easier to do that than a landmark call or the DME calls that are available. Instead of looping through that record and writing it out, you can have the SQL query automatically generate a CSV file from that subset, or from that set of data. So it doesn't loop through the data, it just spits it out. You specify a file name and it'll just dump the data straight to a file. As far as getting to IPA version 11, so this is an in-place upgrade from 10.1.1. It does require LSF 10.09 and Java 8, while recommended, is actually required at this point. So that brings us to the end. If there are any other questions.
Thank you, guys. So we're going to take 5 minutes for any questions. We are going to have to wrap this up because we have something else coming here at 11. But we got like 5 minutes to do what we can.
All right, let's go.
Can the same subprocess be called by different IPAs?
Absolutely. So you can think of a subprocess as a library. So all you would have to do is build your subprocess once, upload it, and then when you build your master IPA flow, you drag the subprocess node out there, and you'll select that library subprocess from your drop-down menu.
So for repeated functions that you're doing over and over again in multiple flows, you no longer have to repeat those nodes, or a lot of people were copying and pasting nodes from one flow to another because it was doing the same thing over and over again. You build it once and then just call it.
I think that's all the questions we have for now. Please feel free to send some in. Questions at RPIC, or you can reach out to Jeff or Jeremy directly. I want to thank Jeff and Jeremy. Wonderful presentation.